She did not scream when she felt the hands on her back, because she had always known, in the deep and wordless place where truth lives before the mind catches up, that it would end like this. And what a beginning that is, dear friends, because this is not a story about a girl who fell. This is a story about a girl who was pushed, and the Duke who refused to let the world lose her. Before we go any further into this world of windswept cliffs, cold castles, and a love that neither of them asked for, if this is your first time here, welcome. Please subscribe to this channel, because we tell tales here that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let us begin. The cliffs of Dunmore Crest had always made Alara Ashford feel something close to free. That was the cruelest irony of it, that the one place in all of Northumberland where she could breathe, where the wind stripped away the careful blankness she wore like a second skin inside Ashford Manor, was also the place that nearly became her grave. She had been coming to these cliffs since she was a small child, when her father was still alive and the world still made a kind of sense. She would stand at the edge of the grassy promontory, close her eyes, and let the sea wind batter her into something that felt, briefly, like joy. The drop was sheer, 200 feet of pale chalk and dark rock plunging into the iron-gray waters of the northern sea. But Alara had never once feared it. She was careful. She was always careful. It was the only way to survive in a house ruled by Lady Vivian Ashford. Her stepmother had come into their lives 4 years ago, smooth and golden and smiling in the way that very dangerous people sometimes smile, as though they are offering you something wonderful, while their other hand searches for what they can take. Alara had been 13 then, still raw with grief over her mother, still reaching across the breakfast table for her father's hand, as though physical contact could stitch the hole in the world closed. She had watched her father look at Vivian the way a drowning man looks at a rope, and she had understood even then that something was ending. Her father had died 14 months later. The physicians called it a failure of the heart. Alara had her own theories, but she was 14, and she was a girl, and she had no one to tell them to. What followed were 3 years of systematic diminishment. Not cruelty of the theatrical kind. Vivian was far too clever for that. There were no locked rooms or withheld meals, nothing so vulgar as to invite comment. Instead, there were small erosions. The gentle redirection of Alara's place at the table. The quiet removal of her mother's portraits from the upstairs hall. The way Vivian spoke to her in company, warmly, so warmly, while her eyes communicated something entirely different. Asterisk, you are tolerated here. You are furniture. You will not cause me trouble. Asterisk. And then there was the inheritance. Alara had not known, until 3 weeks ago, the precise terms of her father's will. She had overheard it, a whispered, furious exchange between Vivian and the family solicitor, Mr. Graves, who had apparently grown a conscience at an inconvenient moment. The estate itself had passed to Vivian upon her father's death, as was customary for a widow. But the liquid inheritance, the considerable sum her father had built through decades of careful investment, had been placed in a protected trust. It would transfer to Alara in full on the morning of her 18th birthday. Untouched, unredirected, hers. Her 18th birthday was 6 weeks away. She had not meant for Vivian to know that she knew. She had been so careful, so relentlessly, exhaustingly careful, but something had shifted in her stepmother's face over the past week. Some calculation had completed itself behind those pale blue eyes. Vivian had begun watching her in a way that felt different from the usual cold management. It felt, though Alara had tried to dismiss the thought as melodrama, like assessment, like timing. This morning, Vivian had suggested a walk. Alara should have refused. Looking back, she could see the shape of it so clearly, the uncharacteristic softness in Vivian's voice, the offer to walk together, just the two of them, like we used to, darling, the route that curved, as if by coincidence, toward the cliff path. But Alara had been so starved for something that resembled a normal relationship with the woman who had taken her mother's place that she had allowed herself a single, fatal moment of hope. They had walked in near silence for 20 minutes, the wind pulling at their skirts, the sea a gray murmur far below. Vivian had spoken of small things, the upcoming social season, a letter from her cousin in Bath, the state of the rose garden. And then, as they reached the promontory, the place Alara loved best, the jutting shelf of chalk where the view opened up into endless silver horizon, Vivian had stopped. She had turned to Alara with an expression that was almost gentle. "You found out about the will," she said. It was not a question. Alara had gone very still. Every instinct she possessed, honed over 4 years of careful survival, screamed at her to be placating, to be soft, to smile and deflect and give Vivian nothing to grip. But something in the directness of it, the sudden dropping of the pretense they had both maintained for years, made her lift her chin instead. "Yes," she said. "I did." The gentleness left Vivian's face like a candle being snuffed. What came next happened very quickly, and yet Alara's memory of it was strangely slow, the way moments of extreme danger sometimes are, as though the mind is insisting on recording every detail. She saw Vivian's hands come up. She registered the intent in her stepmother's eyes, not rage, which she might have understood, but something colder and more terrible than rage. Calculation, decision, the expression of a person doing something they have already, quietly, made peace with. She felt the impact of both palms flat against her chest. And then the ground disappeared. The cliff edge crumbled beneath her heels, the chalk soft from last night's rain, the grass slippery and treacherous. And Alara's arms wheeled uselessly in the open air, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, this is how it ends. Then, not with a locked room or a slow poison. Not with anything so patient. Just 2 hands and a steep drop, and the cold sea waiting below like an open mouth. She did not scream. The hand came out of nowhere. It seized her wrist with a grip so fierce it should have been painful. And in that half-second between falling and being caught, Alara had the bizarre thought that the hand was very large and very warm, and absolutely certain of itself. There was no hesitation in it. No fumbling. Just the sudden, iron-sure fact of it closing around her, and the violent arrest of her fall, and then she was being hauled upward with a controlled, straining strength that told her whoever held her was fighting the full weight of gravity and winning. She came over the edge gasping, her knees scraping chalk and soil, and collapsed onto solid ground in a graceless heap. For a moment she could do nothing but press her palms flat against the earth and breathe. Just breathe, feeling the solidity of it beneath her like a miracle she had not earned. Then she looked up. He was crouching beside her, one hand still encircling her wrist as though he had not yet decided whether to release her, the other braced against the ground for balance. He was, her overwhelmed mind reached for words and found only inadequate ones, formidable. Dark-haired and broad-shouldered, dressed for riding in charcoal gray, with a face that would have been beautiful if it had held any softness whatsoever. It held none. It held instead the particular severity of a man who had weathered something that had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what could not be broken. His eyes were extraordinary, dark and still, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that made the remnants of her terror feel almost secondary. "Are you injured?" His voice was low and precise, each word deliberate. Alara opened her mouth, closed it. Her wrist was still in his hand, and she was aware, with a hyperclarity of shock, of the warmth of his thumb against her pulse point. She began. From behind her, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on chalk, and then Vivian's voice, composed, concerned, heartbreaking in its performance. Alara *, my darling, thank God. I turned away for only a moment, and she walks too close to the edge. She always has. I have told her so many times. The man's dark eyes lifted from Alara's face. They moved to Vivian, and they did not change expression. But something in them went very, very quiet, the particular quiet of a predator that has identified its prey and is in no hurry whatsoever, because it already knows the outcome. He rose to his full height, which was considerable. "I am Celian Voss," he said, and his voice carried no particular inflection. "The Duke of Ravensmoor." He looked down at Alara, still on the ground, still catching her breath, still alive by the margin of one outstretched hand. "And I saw," he said, "everything." The silence that followed those 3 words was the most dangerous silence Alara had ever lived inside. She watched it happen, Watch the information travel across Lady Vivian's face the way a crack travels across ice, swift and almost imperceptible, before the whole surface shifts. For one unguarded instant, something true showed in her stepmother's eyes. Not guilt. Vivian was too composed for guilt, too long practiced in the art of her own justifications. What showed was something rawer and more revealing than guilt. Fear. It was gone in a heartbeat. The mask resettled itself with a smoothness that was almost admirable in its craft. Vivian pressed one gloved hand to her chest and arranged her features into the expression of a woman deeply, genuinely relieved. Your Grace. She dipped into a curtsy, so natural it might have been rehearsed, which Alara had no doubt it had been, not for this precise moment, but for any moment in which power needed to be acknowledged and redirected. What a mercy that you were riding the coastal path. I cannot tell you the fright. Alara has always been impulsive near the cliffs, ever since she was a small child, and I confess I looked away for only. I said, the Duke repeated, with the patient, absolute calm of a man who has never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, that I saw everything. The words were not loud. They were not theatrical. They fell into the salt air between the three of them with a quiet finality of a door being locked from the outside. And this time, Vivian did not attempt to speak over them. She simply held his gaze for a long moment, the gaze of a woman calculating her odds, and then looked down at the chalk-pale ground and said nothing. Alara became aware gradually that she was still on the ground. Her palms were bleeding where she had scraped them against the cliff edge coming over. Shallow cuts, nothing serious, but they stung with a bright immediacy that told her she was still, in fact, alive. Her knees ached. Her wrist, where the Duke had gripped her, was already beginning to purple with what would become a spectacular bruise. She found, peculiarly, that she did not mind it. The bruise would be proof. The bruise would be the mark of a hand that had chosen to hold on. She pressed one bleeding palm flat against the earth and began, with what remained of her dignity, to push herself upright. A hand appeared before her face. She looked at it for a moment. It was offered palm up, steady, entirely without impatience. The hand of a man accustomed to waiting for people to decide whether to trust him, and entirely prepared for them to decide against it. She looked up past it to its owner's face. The Duke of Ravensmore was watching her with those unreadable dark eyes, and his expression communicated nothing she could clearly name, except perhaps a kind of careful attention, the look of a man who was, she sensed, cataloging everything. She took his hand. He drew her to her feet with an ease that was somehow worse than effort would have been. It implied a strength held in such perfect reserve that helping her up required almost none of it. He released her hand the moment she was steady, and stepped back a precise, proper distance, and that too told her something about him. He was a man who understood the language of space and proximity, and who used it deliberately. You are bleeding, he observed. It is not serious. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. She curled her fingers inward to hide the worst of the scrapes. His gaze dropped briefly to her hands, then returned to her face. She had the uncomfortable feeling that he had already assessed the injuries more accurately than her dismissal of them warranted, and had simply chosen, for now, to accept her framing of it. He turned to Vivian. Lady Ashford. His tone was civil, in the way that a blade drawn slowly from its sheath is civil, technically without violence, entirely without comfort. You will return to Ashford Manor. I will see to Miss Ashford's welfare and return her to you presently. It was not a request. Every syllable was architecturally a command, constructed so completely in the form of authority that there was no visible seam through which an objection could be inserted. Alara watched Vivian understand this, watched her absorb the geometry of the situation, the calculus of what could and could not be managed, and reach, with the pragmatism of a true survivor, for the only response available to her. She smiled. Of course, Your Grace. How very kind. She turned to Alara, and the look she gave her stepdaughter lasted only a fraction of a second, warm on the surface, arctic beneath, carrying a message as clear as a spoken sentence. This is not over. Then she dipped her head, turned with perfect composure, and walked back up the cliff path toward the manor, without once looking back. They watched her go. When the sound of her footsteps had faded entirely, absorbed by wind and distance, the Duke said, without looking at Alara, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Good." He moved toward where his horse stood ground-tied on the path below the promontory, a magnificent gray animal, currently observing the proceedings with the mild disinterest of a creature that has witnessed its master in many unusual situations and long since stopped being surprised by them. The Duke retrieved something from his saddlebag, a small cloth, which he returned with and held out. Alara looked at it, then at him. "Your hands," he said simply. She unfolded the cloth. It was clean linen, she noted, soft and white, and it struck her, with a pang she could not entirely account for, that he carried it with the casual preparedness of a man who had learned, at some point, to be ready for other people's injuries. She pressed it carefully against her palms. "I do not live at Ashford Manor," the Duke said, in the tone of a man supplying relevant information without editorializing it. "I am visiting the county on estate business. My own holding, Ravensmoor Hall, is 4 miles east." He paused. "I believe, given the circumstances, that returning you directly to Lady Ashford's household this afternoon would be inadvisable." Alara looked up at him. "You believe my stepmother just pushed me off a cliff, Your Grace?" "Yes," he said, without a flicker of discomfort at the plainness of it. "And yet you phrase it as inadvisable to return me to her." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the distant architectural precursor of one, visible only in the faint easing of the severe line of his mouth. "I phrase it that way because you have not yet confirmed what I observed, and it would be premature of me to act on my own interpretation of events without your account." Alara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying sea salt and the faint smell of bruised grass. A part of her, the part that had spent 4 years learning that the safest thing to say was always nothing, stirred with the old familiar caution. She studied the Duke's face, searching for the shape of an angle, a motive, the particular configuration of interest that meant she was being collected for someone else's purposes. She found none of it. What she found instead, in those still dark eyes, was something she had not encountered in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. He was looking at her, as though what she said next mattered, as though she was a person whose account of her own experience had weight and validity, as though he was genuinely, without agenda, waiting to understand what had happened to her. She felt, to her absolute horror, the distinct burning pressure of tears behind her eyes. She did not let them fall. She had long ago mislaid the habit of crying in front of other people, but the effort of stopping them cost her a moment, and the Duke, who missed nothing, waited through that moment without comment or impatience, which somehow made it worse. "She pushed me," Alara said at last. Her voice was flat and clear. "Both hands flat against my chest. She waited until the ground was soft from last night's rain and the chalk was loose at the edge. She did not stumble into me. She did not lose her footing. She made a choice." She paused. "She has been making choices in my direction for 4 years. This was merely the first one she intended to be final." The Duke received this without visible reaction, which told her that it did not surprise him, and that, somehow, was the most chilling thing of all, that a man who had known her for less than 30 minutes had already suspected her stepmother capable of exactly this. "Then you will come to Ravensmoor Hall," he said. "That is," she hesitated. "That is very irregular, Your Grace." "Considerably less irregular," he replied, with that same precise calm, "than the alternative." He looked at her steadily. "You have no one else in the county you could go to? No friend, no relation, no household that would take you in without first consulting Lady Ashford?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the social architecture Vivian had carefully constructed around her over 3 years, the gentle, imperceptible isolation, the management of her relationships, the way friends had drifted away without any single dramatic rupture she could point to. She thought about what it meant that the only person who had asked her that question in years was a man she had met 20 minutes ago at the edge of a cliff. "No," she said quietly. "There is no one." He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already calculated. He moved to his horse and took the animal's reins with a familiar ease. "I will ride. You will walk beside me. The path is level from here and the distance short enough that a carriage would take longer to arrange than the walk itself." He glanced at her feet, her boots sensible and sturdy, which had served her well on this path 100 times before. "Unless you are more injured than you have told me." "I am not," she said. "Then we will go." He waited, and there was nothing in his manner of the expectation that she would thank him, or the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to having performed an act of kindness, and unsure what to do with the resulting social weight. He simply waited, holding his horse, giving her time to compose herself and choose to follow. She followed. They walked in near silence along the cliff path, turning east, and the sea stretched out below them in hammered silver, and the gray hall of Ravensmoor rose in the middle distance against a pewter sky, like something that had always been there, and had simply been waiting for her to look in the right direction. She did not look back toward Ashford Manor. Behind her, in the drawing-room, she could not see. Lady Vivian Ashford would be sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap, doing what she did best, thinking through the pieces still available to her on the board, and deciding how to play them. But ahead, solid and certain and large with the promise of something Alara could not yet name, the Duke of Ravensmoor walked beside her. And he had not, she realized, let go of his position beside her since the cliff. He walked between her and the drop. Not obviously. Not in a manner that announced itself. Simply as a fact, as a quiet, physical sentence that said, Asterisk, I am here, and you will not fall again. Not while I am beside you, asterisk. She kept her bleeding hands folded in the linen cloth, and she did not cry, and she walked into the rest of her life with her chin up, and her heart hammering, and the strange, new, fragile weight of being seen pressing against the inside of her chest like the first green thing pushing up through frost. Ravensmoor Hall did not welcome people. That was Alara's first impression, and she was honest enough with herself to hold on to it even as the sheer scale of the place stole her breath. It was not unwelcoming in the way of neglect. The grounds were immaculate, the stonework maintained with obvious care, the iron gates freshly blacked and silent on their hinges. It was unwelcoming in the way of a person who has decided, after sufficient cause, that the world beyond their walls offers nothing worth opening to. Every window was tall and narrow. Every arch was severe. The gardens were geometric and flawless, and entirely without wildness, as though beauty had been permitted only on the condition that it submit to order. It looked, Alara thought, precisely like its master. A housekeeper met them at the door, a trim, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 60 named Mrs. Howell, who absorbed the sight of her employer arriving on foot with a bloodied, chalk-dusted young woman beside him with the magnificent composure of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the Duke of Ravensmoor did. She asked no questions. She simply looked at Alara with an assessment that was thorough and not unkind, and said, I will have the east guest chamber prepared within the hour, miss. Thank you, Mrs. Howell. The Duke handed off his horse to a waiting groom and turned to Alara. You will be shown to a sitting room. A physician will be sent for. That is not necessary. Your hands are still bleeding, he said simply, and walked away down the corridor. Alara looked down. He was right. The east guest chamber, when she was finally shown to it, was the most beautiful room she had slept in since her father's death. High ceilings, pale blue walls, a fire already crackling in the marble grate. The bed was hung with silver-gray curtains that moved softly in the warmth from the hearth, and the window looked east over a lawn that dissolved in the distance into open moorland. It felt, in a way she could not immediately explain, like a room that had been waiting at a low simmer, not abandoned, but paused, as though it had been maintained against the possibility of being needed. The physician came and went, pronouncing her scrapes superficial, and her wrist badly bruised but unbroken. Mrs. Howell brought tea and a change of clothes, a simple gray dress that fit well enough and smelled faintly of lavender, and asked, with a gentleness that surprised Alara coming from so brisk a woman, whether there was anything else she required. Only to walk a little, Alara said. If that is permitted. The house is open to you, miss. His Grace's instructions. She had not expected that. She turned it over in her mind as she moved through the corridors of Ravensmore Hall in the quiet of the late afternoon. The extraordinary blanket permission of it, the trust implied, from a man who had known her for less than a day. She found the portrait gallery by accident. It was on the second floor, down a corridor that curved away from the main landing in a direction that seemed almost designed to be overlooked. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, and the long room received her in near darkness, the late light falling in thin bars through half-shuttered windows and laying itself across the faces of the painted dead. She walked slowly, reading the names on the small brass plaques beneath each frame. Generations of Voss ancestors regarded her with varying degrees of severity. Stern-faced patriarchs, composed matriarchs, an occasional younger face looking out with something that might have been hope before circumstance finished with it. The collection moved roughly in chronological order from the door inward, and so it was only at the far end of the room, where the light was thinnest and the most recent portraits hung, that she saw her. Alara stopped walking. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 25, painted in a gown of deep green against a background of stormy sky. She had dark hair and a pointed, fine-boned face, and her eyes, the painter had caught something genuinely alive in them, were tilted slightly upward at the outer corners, giving her a look of perpetual, private amusement. She looked, in the angle of the jaw, and the set of the eyes, and the particular way her chin lifted, startlingly like Alara. Not exactly. Not like a mirror, but enough, more than enough, to stop the breath. Alara leaned in toward the brass plaque. Asterisk Isadora Voss, Duchess of Ravensmore. 1842-1864, asterisk. 22 years old. Dead for 6 years. And the Duke, who could not be more than 30 now, had been carrying it all this time, had locked himself inside this immaculate, severe, carefully ordered house and maintained it like a monument to whatever had been lost. She was nothing like you. Alara spun around. The Duke stood in the doorway. He was not angry. She had expected anger, had braced for the particular cold fury of a private man whose private things had been trespassed upon. Instead, he looked, in the thin gray light, simply tired. Old in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I am sorry," Alara said at once. "I did not mean to intrude." "You did not intrude." He moved into the room with the deliberate pace of a man approaching something he has avoided for a long time. He stopped beside her and looked up at the portrait, and the expression on his face was one of the most painful things she had ever seen on another person. Not grief, exactly. Something that had moved past grief into a kind of ruined familiarity. People always remark on the resemblance. There's one around the eyes. But he paused. She was someone who found everything amusing. "You," he said, glancing at her briefly, "do not look as though you have found very much amusing in some time." "No," Alara agreed quietly. "I have not." He nodded, as though this was the honest answer he had expected, and respected her for giving it. They stood together in silence before the portrait of his dead wife, and the fire in the distant grate ticked softly, and outside the wind moved across the moors with a sound like breathing. "She did not fall ill," Alara said, before she could stop herself. "Did she?" The Duke was quiet for a very long time. "No," he said at last. "She did not." The silence after his admission was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Alara did not press him. She had learned, in 4 years of living inside a house where the wrong question could shift the entire weather of a day, when to speak and when to simply remain, to offer her presence as something steady and without demand. She looked back at the portrait of Isadora Voss and waited. The Duke moved to the window at the far end of the gallery. He stood with his back to her, one hand braced against the shutter, looking out over the moors in the last gray light of the afternoon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and entirely without performance. "We were married when I was 22 and she was 20. It was arranged, both families in agreement, both parties compliant. I will not tell you it was a love match, because it was not, and Isadora deserved better than a pretty fiction told about her memory." He paused. "But she was kind, genuinely kind, in the way that some people simply are, without effort, without agenda. I was not easy to be married to." She managed it with more grace than I had any right to expect. Elara said nothing. The fire ticked. The wind pressed at the shutters. She died in the second year of our marriage. A riding accident. That is what the record states, what the coroner determined, what every person in this county believes. He turned from the window then, and looked at Elara with eyes that were very dark and very direct. What the record does not state is that Isadora was an exceptional rider. That she had been riding that particular horse on that particular path since she was 14 years old. That the horse was found uninjured, with no evidence of having thrown her. And that 3 days before her death, she had told me she was frightened. The word landed between them with terrible weight. Frightened of what? Elara asked. She would not say. I pressed her once and she deflected, and something moved across his face, swift and savage, like a wound reopened. I did not press again. I told myself it was nothing, that she was prone to melancholy in the autumn months, that I would speak to her again the following week. He stopped. There was no following week. Elara understood then the precise nature of what he carried. Not guilt in the simple sense, not the guilt of a man who had done harm, but something more complex and more corrosive. The guilt of a man who had possessed the one small moment in which everything might have been different, and had let it pass. You were 23 years old, she said quietly. He looked at her. You were 23, she repeated, and she did not tell you clearly, and you made the most human choice available. You assumed there was time. She held his gaze steadily. That is not the same as failing her, is it not? No. Her voice was gentle, but without concession. I know what it looks like when someone fails another person deliberately, Your Grace. I have lived inside that house for 4 years. What you are describing is not that. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, not the sudden unburdening she might have hoped for. It was slower and more complicated than that. The look of a man who had heard a thing that he could not immediately accept, but could not entirely dismiss either. As though she had placed a key on the table in front of him that he was not yet ready to pick up. He turned back to the window. I should not have brought you into this room, he said. Not coldly. More like a man resetting the terms of an encounter that had moved further than he had planned. You did not bring me. I wandered in on my own. I should not have spoken of this. Perhaps not, Elara agreed. But you did. And I think, she hesitated, aware she was moving onto ground where she had no clear right to stand. I think you spoke of it because you have not spoken of it in a very long time. And some things grow heavier in silence. He did not respond to that. But he did not dismiss it either. Mrs. Howell appeared at the gallery door with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had an unerring instinct for the precise moment an encounter needed interrupting. She announced that dinner would be served in the small dining room at 7, and that she had taken the liberty of sending word to Ashford Manor that Miss Ashford was safe and would be returned the following day. The following day, Elara repeated. The roads are poor after dark, the Duke said, in a tone that closed the subject with complete finality. He moved toward the door and paused. Miss Ashford. She looked at him. What you said about things growing heavier in silence. He did not look at her directly. You speak as someone who knows it from experience. I do, she said simply. He nodded once and left. Elara remained alone in the portrait gallery for a moment longer. She looked up at Isadora's painted face, at those tilted, amused eyes that had seen something frightening and had not been able to say it clearly enough to the right person in the right time. She thought, I will not make that mistake. Then she followed the warmth of the lamps back down the corridor toward the land of the living, and did not look behind her. Lady Vivian Ashford did not panic. That was, perhaps, her most dangerous quality. Lesser villains panicked. They made noise, drew attention, overplayed their hand in the hours immediately following a crisis, and unraveled themselves through sheer agitation. Vivian had always understood that the space between a plan failing and a new plan forming was a space to be occupied with perfect stillness, a held breath, a composed face, a cup of tea taken in the drawing room, as though the afternoon had been entirely unremarkable. She sat now at the writing desk in Ashford Manor's front parlor, the late evening light falling across her hands, and she wrote letters. The first was to her solicitor, not Mr. Graves, who had grown inconveniently principled, but a second man, one she had retained for situations that required a more flexible interpretation of legal ethics. The letter was brief and encoded in the mundane language of estate management, but its instructions were clear enough to anyone who knew how to read them. Begin constructing a case for the invalidation of the trust on grounds of the beneficiary's mental and emotional instability. Gather what could be gathered. Manufacture what could not. The second letter was to Mrs. Alderton, the most formidably connected gossip in the county, phrased as a note of anxious confidence between two women who understood the burden of difficult family situations. It described, with carefully calibrated distress, Lara's history of impulsive behavior near the cliffs, had done it since childhood, simply would not listen to reason, and her current, deeply worrying residence at Ravensmore Hall, which surely no one of right feeling could consider appropriate for an unmarried girl of 17. However, the Duke chose to characterize his intentions. She sealed both letters, handed them to the footman, and poured herself more tea. The Duke of Ravensmore was a complication. She had known of him in the abstract. The county knew him, in the way one knows a feature of the landscape that one has no particular reason to engage with, but she had not accounted for his presence on the coastal path. That had been careless. She did not enjoy being careless. It suggested a gap in her preparation that she found genuinely offensive, as though the world had broken an agreement to behave predictably. But he was, in the end, a man, and men, in Vivian's experience, were navigable. They had pride and reputation and ambition, and those were all handles. The Duke had a particular reputation for coldness, for disengagement from the county's social machinery, for a self-sufficiency that bordered on contempt. That same coldness, she reasoned, would limit his appetite for prolonged involvement in someone else's domestic complication. He had performed the rescue. He had made his point. A man of his nature would, shortly, find the presence of a penniless 17-year-old girl in his household tiresome, and arrange for her removal somewhere neutral. A distant relation, a school, anywhere that was not under his roof and therefore not his problem. Vivian intended to help that process along. She had not counted on Mrs. Alderton moving quite so quickly. By the following morning, she had underestimated the velocity of county gossip, which was, in fairness, always a mistake. By 10 o'clock the news had reached 4 drawing rooms. By noon it had acquired elaborations. By the time it reached the ears of Ravensmore Hall's housekeeper, via the butcher's boy, via the blacksmith's wife, it had accumulated enough insinuation to constitute a small scandal. Mrs. Howell brought the intelligence to the Duke during his morning correspondence. She reported it with the compressed efficiency of a woman who views unnecessary words as a form of waste. A story was circulating. It suggested that Miss Ashford was known for erratic behavior. It implied that her presence at Ravensmore Hall was inappropriate. It positioned Lady Ashford as a concerned guardian helplessly navigating a difficult charge. The story had the fingerprints of design all over it, too consistent, too well-timed, too specifically targeted at the 2 points most likely to create pressure, Lara's reputation and the Duke's. The Duke listened without expression. He set down his pen. "Send word to Mr. Calloway," he said. Calloway was his own solicitor, a man of formidable competence and absolute discretion, who had handled Ravensmore legal affairs for 15 years. "I wish to see him today. And Mrs. Howell," he paused. "Say nothing to Miss Ashford yet." Lara, unaware of the machinery turning on her behalf, was in the library. She had woken early, disoriented by the unfamiliar silence of a house that did not carry the ambient tension of Ashford Manor. No footsteps calculated to communicate displeasure. No doors closed with precisely enough force to register without technically slamming. The quiet of Ravensmore was a different quality of quiet entirely. It was the quiet of a place that had simply chosen stillness, rather than one enforcing it. She had found the library at the end of the east corridor and stopped in the doorway with the feeling of someone who has unexpectedly come home. It was vast and warm and smelled of old paper and cedar, and its shelves ran floor to ceiling and were clearly the work of someone who had read every volume rather than simply acquired them for appearance. She had stood in the doorway for a full minute, just breathing it in, before stepping inside. She was deep in a volume of natural history, an illustrated edition she had pulled with no particular purpose, and then found herself genuinely absorbed in, when she heard his footsteps. She had already, in less than 24 hours, learned the particular cadence of them. Measured, deliberate. The walk of a man who moved through his own house as though it too was a thing to be managed carefully. The Duke appeared in the library doorway and looked at her, curled in the chair nearest the fire, shoes tucked up, entirely at ease in a way she had not been at ease anywhere in 4 years, and something moved briefly across his face before he composed it. "Lady Ashford," he said, "has begun her campaign." Ilara closed the book slowly. She had known it was coming. She had known since the moment Vivian walked back up the cliff path with that composed, deliberate step, not the step of a woman defeated, but of a woman regrouping. "Tell me," she said quietly. And the cold fury that settled over the Duke's face as he did was, she realized, not directed at her. It was directed, with absolute precision, at the woman who had pushed her. It was, unexpectedly, the most protected she had felt in years. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, which was, as Mrs. Howell observed to no one in particular, terrible timing. Lord and Lady Pembridge of Carrow House were hosting their autumn ball, an event of sufficient regional significance that declining it required either a documented illness or a death in the family, and even the latter was considered in certain circles to be cutting it rather fine. The Duke of Ravensmore had declined it for the past 5 consecutive years with no apparent damage to his conscience. The invitation this year, however, arrived at a moment when the county was already watching Ravensmore Hall with considerable interest, and the Duke looked at it for a long moment before setting it on the desk beside Calloway's preliminary report on Lady Vivian's financial maneuvers. He picked up his pen and wrote a reply accepting for 2. Ilara received the news with the expression of a woman who has survived a cliff and a stepmother's conspiracy in the same week, and has therefore recalibrated what constitutes a genuinely alarming development. She was quiet for a moment, then said practically, "I have nothing suitable to wear." The Duke, who had apparently anticipated this, said, "Mrs. Howell will see to it," and returned to his correspondence in a manner that suggested the matter was resolved. Mrs. Howell, who had once dressed a duchess and retained both the knowledge and the contacts for it, did indeed see to it, with remarkable speed and a satisfaction in her bearing that suggested she had been waiting years for someone to dress properly in this house again. The gown she produced was deep blue silk, simply cut, with none of the aggressive ornamentation currently fashionable. It suited Ilara in the way that things suit people who have good bones and have never been given a chance to know it. Ilara looked at herself in the glass and felt, briefly and almost painfully, like herself. Carrow House was ablaze with candlelight when they arrived, and the effect of the Duke of Ravensmore appearing at a social event was immediate and comprehensive. Conversations paused. Heads turned. And then his companion registered, and the pause deepened into something more charged, the room performing, in real time, the rapid recalculation of everything it thought it knew. Lady Vivian was present. Of course, she was present. She stood near the far window in ivory and pearls, and when her gaze found Ilara across the candlelit room, it held for precisely 2 seconds before she looked away and lifted her champagne glass in a gesture of perfect unconcern. But her knuckles, Ilara noted, were white against the stem. The Duke did not acknowledge Vivian's presence by so much as a glance. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who understands that his presence alone constitutes a social act, offering the minimum necessary courtesy to those who approached him, and keeping Ilara at his side in a manner that was proper in its geometry and entirely unmistakable in its meaning. He was not escorting her as a courtesy. He was standing beside her as a statement. Several people tried to speak to Ilara with a kind of probing warmth, the social equivalent of pressing a bruise to see how deep it went. She answered them with composure and a directness she had not allowed herself in years, and felt, with each exchange, the strange returning sensation of occupying her own space without apology. Then the dancing began. She had not expected him to dance. Nothing in what she knew of him suggested a man who waltzed. It was too performative, too much a concession to the social theater he so clearly found tedious. And yet he appeared before her as the first waltz struck up and offered his hand with a grave simplicity that characterized everything he did. "You do not have to," she said. "I am aware." He waited, hand extended. She took it. He danced as she might have predicted, beautifully, not with the studied flourish of a man who performs dancing, but with the natural authority of a man who does everything with his body precisely and without waste. His hand at her waist was correct and firm and warm through the silk, and she was close enough to see the particular way he was looking at her, not at the room, not past her, but at her, with that focused, unguarded attention that she was beginning to understand was his truest expression. "People are staring," she said. "Yes. You intended that." "Reputation," he said, navigating a turn with unhurried grace, "is a tool. Lady Ashford has been using it against you for 4 years. It seemed reasonable to employ it differently." He paused. "Every person in this room will know by morning that you have my public support. That will not solve everything, but it will make certain avenues considerably less convenient for her." Alara was quiet for a moment, feeling the music move through them both. "You are doing this for strategy." "Partly." She looked up at him. "And the other part?" The candlelight moved across his face. The severe lines of it were not softened. Exactly, he was not a man who softened, but something in his expression had shifted in the weeks she had been at Ravensmoor. Something had been incrementally unlocked. "You looked," he said carefully, "like someone who had not stood in a room and been seen clearly in a very long time." He held her gaze. "I found I wanted to change that." The waltz moved them in a slow golden arc, and Alara felt it then. The full, undeniable weight of it settling into her chest, like warm light into a cold room. She was falling in love with this man. She had perhaps begun the moment his hand closed around her wrist above the cliff. And the terrifying thing, the thing that made her glad of the music and the movement and the excuse not to speak, was not the falling itself. It was that she was almost certain, watching his face above hers in the candlelight, that he already knew. It began with a locked box, and a question neither of them asked aloud. 3 days after the ball, Calloway arrived at Ravensmoor Hall with a leather satchel and an expression that communicated, with professional restraint, that what it contained was worse than expected. He spread the documents across the Duke's library desk in careful order, deeds, ledgers, correspondence, notarized transfers, and walked them through it with the measured pace of a man who understands that some information requires time to land properly. The picture that emerged was methodical and cold. Lady Vivian had begun moving against Alara's inheritance, not after her father's death, but before it. There were transfers dated within the final months of Lord Ashford's illness. Small ones initially, easily overlooked, dressed in the language of household management and estate maintenance. Then larger ones, requiring signatures that bore a troubling resemblance to Lord Ashford's hand, but had been witnessed by people no longer traceable. And threaded through all of it, like a dark stitch, was the correspondence with the second solicitor, the flexible one, outlining a strategy to have the trust contested on grounds of Alara's alleged instability before her 18th birthday could transfer control irrevocably to her. Calloway departed with his instructions. The Duke remained at the desk, very still. Alara had not been present for the meeting. She found him there an hour later, when she came looking for a particular volume she had replaced on the wrong shelf the previous evening. She stopped in the doorway, reading the atmosphere the way she had learned to read rooms, and the room said clearly that something significant had happened. "Tell me," she said. It was becoming. She realized the sentence she said to him most. And he, she realized, always did. He told her. She sat down. Not dramatically. She simply reached behind her for the nearest chair and sat in it, and pressed her folded hands against her mouth, and was quiet for a long moment, while she absorbed the full shape of what had been done to her father and to her. It was one thing to know Vivian was dangerous. It was another to see the architecture of it, the years of it, the patience of it, the sheer volume of deliberate harm constructed so carefully over so long. She began while he was still alive, Ilara said at last. Yes. While he was ill and could not. While he trusted her, she stopped. The sentence had too many directions, and none of them led anywhere bearable. Yes, the Duke said again quietly. She stood up. Then we find the rest of it. He looked at her for a moment, and whatever he saw in her face made him rise also, without argument, and move to the far wall of the library where a secondary cabinet held the overflow of estate documents, including those inherited from neighboring land transactions. If there were further connections to be found, they would be here. They worked through the night. It was not romantic in any constructed sense. There were no convenient excuses for closeness, no orchestrated moments. It was simply two people at adjacent ends of a large desk, each with a lamp and a stack of documents, moving through the methodical work of uncovering the truth. Mrs. Howell brought tea at 10 and again at midnight, and said nothing, which was its own form of eloquence. The fire settled and was rebuilt. Outside, the moors were entirely dark and entirely silent. But there was something in the silence between them that had changed since the ball. The careful social distance had not dissolved. He was still precise in his movements, still deliberate in his speech, but something underneath it had shifted in the way deep water shifts, without disturbing the surface. She was aware of him with a specificity that was entirely new. The way he annotated documents in a small, exact hand. The way he occasionally exhaled slowly through his nose when something frustrated him. The only outward sign that frustration existed. The way he had, without comment or ceremony, moved his lamp to the center of the desk when he noticed hers was flickering, sacrificing his own light for her clarity. She found the second set of forged signatures at 1:30 in the morning. Here. She pushed the document toward him. He leaned in to examine it, and they were briefly very close, his shoulder nearly at her eye level, his head bent over the paper, close enough that she could see the slight furrow between his brows as he read. That is not her signature, he said. That is her handwriting imitating your father's. Look at the pressure variation. She writes heavily on downstrokes, and so does this. Your father's original correspondence is light throughout. He set two documents side by side. Calloway will be able to demonstrate this to any court in England. Can we take this to the magistrate? We can do considerably more than that. He straightened. His eyes met hers, and they were very close still, and neither of them moved away. Calloway will file an injunction against any contest of the trust by Monday. The forged documents constitute criminal fraud. Lady Ashford will not simply lose her case. She will face prosecution. Ilara absorbed this. The relief of it was enormous, and underneath the relief, something else. The strange vertiginous feeling of a threat that had been the fixed center of her world for years beginning, finally, to collapse inward. It is almost over, she said softly. Almost to herself. Almost, he agreed. He had not moved. The lamp burned steadily between them, and his face in the warm light was as serious as always. But the quality of the seriousness had changed. It was not the seriousness of a man managing a situation. It was the seriousness of a man managing himself. Ilara. It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to notice it at the same moment she did, and did not retract it. When this is resolved, he paused. Began again. When you have your inheritance and your freedom and every option available to you. He stopped. She waited. I want you to know, he said carefully, that whatever you choose, wherever you go, what has happened in this house between us in these weeks, it has not been obligation. He held her gaze with the absolute steadiness of a man who does not say things he does not mean. It has not been proximity or gratitude or loneliness. I want you to understand the difference. The lamp burned. The moors lay dark and quiet beyond the glass. I understand the difference, Ilara said softly. And she did. The morning after was quiet in the particular way of things that have shifted permanently. Nothing looked different. The library held its usual order, the breakfast room its usual light, the corridors their usual measured silence. And yet Ravensmoor Hall felt, to Ilara, like a house that had exhaled, as though the walls themselves had been holding something tightly for a very long time and had, in the small hours of the previous night, allowed it to loosen. She did not see the Duke until late morning. When she did, it was in the East Garden. She had gone out for air, wrapping herself in a borrowed coat against the October chill, and found him already there, standing at the garden's far edge, where the formal geometry dissolved into open moorland. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and was looking out at nothing in particular with the expression of a man conducting a serious internal argument. She almost retreated. Something stopped her. The memory of his voice the previous night. The careful weight of it has not been obligation. And instead she walked toward him across the frost-stiffened grass. He heard her coming and turned. The serious expression did not leave his face, but it rearranged itself into something that was, for him, almost open. "You did not sleep," she said. "No." He looked back at the moors briefly. "Did you?" "A little." She came to stand beside him. The cold was clean and sharp and smelled of peat and distant rain. "I kept thinking about my father, about how much of what was done to him happened while I was in the house, while I was at breakfast and in the garden and sleeping in my room." She paused. "I have been trying to decide whether that should make me feel guilty. It should not. I know that rationally." "Grief is rarely rational," he said. "I spent the better part of 2 years after Isadora died cataloging every conversation in which I might have noticed something sooner, said something differently, made some small adjustment that would have changed the outcome." He was quiet. "It is a very human impulse, and a completely useless one." "Did you stop?" "Eventually. I stopped when I understood that punishing myself was a way of staying close to her." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most true things, as though the truth deserved plainness more than performance. That grief, made into guilt, could be maintained indefinitely. Whereas actual grief, grief that is simply loss, without the self-punishment wrapped around it, grief eventually moves. Alara looked at him. In the flat October light, he was sharp and dark and very still, and she thought about what it must have taken to arrive at that understanding, not the intellectual grasping of it, but the lived, painful earning of it. To have held something that tightly, and then, by force of honest reckoning, to have opened the hand. "You are not who people think you are," she said. "What do people think I am? Cold, remote, indifferent to other people's inner lives. And what do you think I am?" She considered him for a moment, honestly. "I think you're a man who feels things at a depth that frightened you once, and so you built the architecture of this." She gestured slightly, meaning the house, the manor, the whole carefully constructed machinery of his withdrawal, to keep the scale of it manageable. She paused. "I think it has been very lonely." The wind moved across the moor. A distant bird called once and was silent. "Yes," he said. The word was barely above a breath. "It has been." She reached up then. She had not planned it, had not constructed the moment or rehearsed it or made a careful decision. Her hand simply rose, as honest things do, and she placed her palm gently against the side of his face. He went absolutely still. Not the stillness of refusal. The stillness of something encountering an unexpected warmth, and not yet knowing what to do with it. The stillness of a creature that has been cold for so long that heat itself requires adjustment. She felt the line of his jaw under her hand. The slight roughness of it. The way a muscle in his cheek moved fractionally, as though something beneath the surface was shifting. He did not pull away. He did not speak. He simply stood there, and she felt, through the contact, the slow, careful giving way of something that had been held rigid for years, not collapsing, but releasing, the way a door opens that has been shut a long time, with a certain resistance, and then, all at once, ease. His hand came up and covered hers, not removing it, holding it in place. They stayed like that for a moment that had no particular length. The moor stretched out around them in brown and gray and distant purple, and the cold air moved, and somewhere in the house behind them a clock struck the half-hour. "I have not allowed anyone close," he said finally, very quietly, "since Isadora. Not because I did not think I could survive it, but because I did not believe it was possible to." He stopped. Searched for the word, to find something true again. "I believed that what I'd had was singular, that the only honest response to losing it was to stop looking." "And now?" she asked. He turned his head slightly, so that her hand shifted to his cheek, and he looked at her directly, fully, with none of the careful management she had grown used to. Now I find myself significantly less certain of that belief than I was 6 weeks ago, he said. It was not a declaration of poetry. It was not the language of romance novels or drawing-room confessions. It was the plainest possible sentence, offered by a plain-speaking man who had weighed every word before releasing it. To Alara, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She lowered her hand slowly. He released it with the same care with which he had held it. They stood together on the edge of the formal garden, looking out over the open moor, and the space between them felt different from every previous version of that space, charged no longer with careful distance, but with the warm, steady certainty of something real. Neither of them needed to name it yet. It was enough, for now, simply to know that it was there. The letters arrived on a Tuesday, and they arrived in quantity. Alara learned of them not from the Duke, who had intercepted them first, but from Mrs. Howell, whose expression when she appeared in the library doorway communicated that something had happened which required immediate attention and considerable composure to receive. There were 4. 1 to the county magistrate, 1 to the regional ecclesiastical authority, 1 to a private institution in York that specialized in the management of young women deemed unfit for independent life, and 1 to the Duke himself, personal, formal, written in Vivian's beautiful copperhouse hand, informing him that his harboring of her stepdaughter, a young woman of documented emotional instability and dangerous impulsive tendencies, constituted both a reputational risk to his name and a legal liability he would do well to consider carefully. Each letter was accompanied by supporting documentation. Statements from 2 physicians, names Alara did not recognize, attesting to episodes of delusion and erratic behavior. A letter purportedly from a former governess describing violent outbursts. A notarized affidavit from an unnamed household servant detailing Alara's alleged habit of self-destructive behavior near cliff edges. The last one made Alara's hands go cold when she read it. Vivian had not simply tried to kill her. She had, in the weeks since, been constructing the retrospective justification for it, building, piece by piece, a version of Alara that would make the cliff make sense. A troubled girl, a reckless girl, a girl who had always, sadly, been drawn to edges. She set the papers down very carefully on the library desk. These physicians, she said, I have never met them. No. The Duke stood at the window with his back to the room. His stillness was different from his usual stillness, coiled, she thought, like something under significant pressure, being maintained by will alone. The affidavits are fabricated. The governess retired to Edinburgh 4 years ago and has had no contact with your household since. Calloway is already making inquiries. The institution in York will receive a response from my solicitor before end of business today. He turned from a window, and his face was the face she had seen on the cliff path, not cold precisely, but stripped of everything except absolute clarity of purpose. Lady Ashford has miscalculated. She has moved from financial conspiracy into criminal defamation and fraud on a scale that is no longer manageable quietly. She is desperate, Alara said. Yes, and desperate people make the mistake of overextension. He crossed to the desk and picked up Vivian's personal letter to him, looked at it briefly, and set it down with the deliberate calm of a man declining to be provoked. She believes this will frighten me into withdrawing my protection of you. She believes my reputation is more important to me than the truth. Is it not? She asked it without accusation, genuinely. He looked at her steadily. My reputation, he said, is a tool. I told you this. Tools exist to be used. He paused. I intend to use it today. He sent word to Vivian that afternoon requesting her presence at Ravensmore Hall, not framed as a request, but as a summons, couched in language so formally courteous that the iron beneath it was all the more apparent. He sent word also to Calloway, to the county magistrate, a man who owed the Duke a considerable professional courtesy, and to 2 witnesses of unimpeachable standing. Vivian arrived at 4 o'clock. She came dressed for battle, pearl gray silk, her hair immaculate, her composure so perfectly assembled that she might have been attending a pleasant social call. She stepped into the Duke's formal reception room and surveyed its occupants with the rapid intelligence of a general reading a field. And only the faintest tightening around her eyes betrayed the recognition that the geography was not what she had anticipated. The Duke stood at the room's center. Calloway occupied a chair to his right with an open document case. The magistrate stood near the window. 2 witnesses, a local clergyman and the county's most senior justice of the peace, sat in chairs along the wall with the careful expressions of men who understood they were present to observe and remember. Alara stood to the Duke's left. She had dressed with quiet care, the deep blue silk again, because it was the dress in which she had first felt like herself, and she held her hands still at her sides and looked at her stepmother across the room with an expression she had spent years practicing, calm and clear, and entirely without fear. Vivian looked at the configuration of the room for a long moment. Then she looked at Alara. Then she looked at the Duke. "Your Grace," she said, "this is rather theatrical, is it not?" "Sit down, Lady Ashford," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The full weight of his title, his authority, his fortune, his reputation, and 6 weeks of controlled fury were entirely present in those 4 words, and Vivian, who was intelligent above all things, understood that she was looking at a man who had finished being patient. She sat. What followed was not theatrical. It was, in its way, far worse than theater. It was administrative. Calloway presented documents. The Duke spoke in the measured, precise language of a man who has prepared every sentence. The forged signatures were laid on the table. The fabricated physician statements were identified, their authors named, and their connections to Vivian's second solicitor established. The financial transfers from Lord Ashford's final months were traced with the careful thoroughness of someone who has had weeks to follow every thread. Vivian said very little. She was too intelligent to compound her situation with improvised defense. But at one point, as Calloway laid out the final document, the communication to the York institution, something shifted in her composure, and she looked at Alara with an expression that was entirely unguarded for just a moment. It was not remorse. It was not shame. It was, Alara thought, something almost like bafflement, the genuine confusion of a person who cannot understand how they arrived at a place where all their careful architecture had come apart. Alara held her gaze and said nothing. The Duke turned to her then, not to Vivian, to Alara. In front of the magistrate, the clergyman, the justice of the peace, and the woman who had spent for years trying to erase her from the world. He turned and looked at her with that full, unhurried attention. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was perfectly level. "You have spent 4 years without protection in a household that meant you harm. I am asking you, before these witnesses, whether you will accept my permanent protection." A pause. "As my wife." The room was absolutely silent. Vivian's composure, at last, cracked entirely. Alara looked at the Duke, at this severe, careful, quietly extraordinary man who had reached over the edge of a cliff for her and had not, in all the weeks since, once let go, and felt the question settle into her chest like something that had always belonged there. "Yes," she said. "I will." The legal proceedings against Lady Vivian Ashford moved with the efficient gravity of a stone rolling downhill. There was no dramatic trial, no public spectacle. Vivian was too intelligent for that, and her solicitor, the flexible one, had apparently developed his own survival instincts and counseled immediate cooperation. She relinquished all claims against the trust within the week. The forged documents were submitted to the magistrate. The fabricated physician statements were formally withdrawn. The house at Ashford Manor, the estate itself, which had passed to Vivian on Lord Ashford's death, remained hers under the original terms of the will, which the Duke's legal team examined and found, in that respect, to be legitimate. It was not everything. Justice rarely is. But the inheritance was restored, the conspiracy dismantled, and Lady Vivian Ashford removed from every position of power over Alara's life with a thoroughness that left no loose threads. Alara signed the final documents on a Thursday morning in Calloway's office, with the Duke seated across the desk and a pale autumn sun coming through the window, And when it was done, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and simply breathed. "It is over," Calloway said, with professional satisfaction. "Yes," she said. "It is." She turned 18 4 days later. The Duke marked the occasion with no ceremony, which was, she had come to understand, entirely consistent with how he expressed care. There was no party, no assembled guests, no performance of celebration. There was simply, at breakfast, a small package beside her teacup, wrapped in plain paper and tied with dark ribbon. Inside was a copy of the natural history volume she had been reading the morning after her arrival, not borrowed from his shelves, but her own, new, with her name written inside the front cover in his small exact hand. Beneath her name, for words, for your own shelves. She pressed the book against her chest and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. And the Duke drank his tea and looked out the window with the expression of a man who has said precisely what he meant and requires no acknowledgement of it. They were married 6 weeks later. It was a quiet ceremony. The village church, a handful of witnesses, the clergyman who had been present at Vivian's unraveling and seemed genuinely pleased to participate in the resolution. Mrs. Howell wept with complete composure, which was a skill Alara deeply admired. Calloway attended and shook the Duke's hand with the warm relief of a man who has watched his client make exclusively sensible decisions for the first time in years. On the afternoon of the wedding day, as the light turned gold and the wind came in from the sea, the Duke took Alara's hand and asked if she would walk with him. She knew where they were going before they arrived. The cliffs of Dunmore Crest caught the late sun and held it, the chalk bright, the sea far below hammered into copper and silver, the grass moving in long slow waves toward the edge. They stood at the promontory where it had all begun, and the drop was just as sheer as it had always been, and the wind was just as relentless, and Alara looked out over the horizon and felt something she had not felt in this place since she was a small child. Free. Actually, fully free. The Duke stood beside her, between her and the drop, she noticed, as he always positioned himself, quietly and without announcement. He was looking at the sea with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one, not the managed severity of the public man, but something open and a little raw, like a landscape after rain. He took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the urgency of the first time, all desperate grip and 200 feet of open air. Simply and completely, his fingers finding hers and folding around them with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided, and is at peace with his decision. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the East Garden. That it had been lonely. Yes, you were right." He looked down at their joined hands briefly, then back at the sea. "I had become so accustomed to the loneliness that I had stopped registering it as an absence. It had simply become the texture of things, the way they were. And now," he turned to look at her then, fully, in the golden light, and she saw in his face everything he was, the grief that had shaped him and the strength that had survived it, the severity that was not coldness, but care held very tightly, the precise and stubborn and extraordinary capacity for love that he had locked away and was now, slowly and deliberately, returning to use. "Now," he said, "I find I can feel the difference." She leaned into him, and his arm came around her, and they stood together at the edge of the cliff, not at the mercy of it, not falling, not pushed, but choosing it. Standing at the precipice of their own lives and looking out at the horizon with the particular courage of people who have already survived the worst the world could arrange for them and have discovered, on the other side of it, that they are not alone. The wind moved through them. The sea went on forever. Celian pressed his lips to her hair and said nothing, because nothing was needed. And Alara, who had come to this cliff her whole life looking for something that felt like freedom, finally, completely, understood that freedom had never been the absence of another person. It had been waiting, all along, for the right hand to hold. 1 year later, Ravensmoor Hall was a different house. Not in its bones. The stone was the same, the corridors as long, the moors as wide and gray and breathing beyond the eastern windows. But something in its atmosphere had shifted in the way that houses shift when they are genuinely lived in rather than merely maintained. There were books left open on chairs. There were cut flowers from the garden in rooms that had never held flowers before. There was, on certain evenings, the sound of two voices in conversation drifting from the library, one measured and precise, one lighter, occasionally dissolving into laughter that the old walls received with something very like relief. Mrs. Howell had stopped looking quietly worried. This, those who knew her understood, was the highest possible endorsement. Elara stood at the library window on a late October morning. 1 year, almost to the day, since a hand had pulled her back from the edge of everything, and watched her husband cross the garden below. He walked with his usual deliberate pace, hands clasped behind his back, head slightly bent in thought. He had not seen her yet. She watched him unobserved for a moment with the particular tenderness of someone who has been given something they once believed was not available to them, and has not yet grown so accustomed to it that they have stopped noticing. He looked up, found her in the window, and the expression that moved across his face, quick, unguarded, entirely real, was the one she treasured most. Not the almost smile, not the composed attention. Something simpler and more complete than either. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. He lifted one hand in acknowledgement, economical, understated, entirely him, and continued across the garden toward the door. She thought about Vivian sometimes. Not with hatred. Hatred required a sustained investment she had decided, quietly and deliberately, not to make. Vivian lived at Ashford Manor still, reduced and watchful, a cautionary tale the county had largely written and moved on from. Elara wished her no specific harm. She simply did not wish her anything at all, which was its own form of freedom. She thought about her father more, about his quietness, his kindness, his failure of imagination regarding the world's capacity for cruelty. She had stopped being angry with him. In its place was something softer and more sustainable, the ordinary, lasting grief of loving someone imperfect, who loved you as well as they knew how. She kept his book on the shelf nearest the window. The natural history volume. Her name inside the front cover, below his. The library door opened. The Duke of Ravensmore came in from the cold with wind-swept hair and the particular expression of a man returning to a room that contains everything he values most. He crossed to where she stood at the window and stopped beside her, looking out at the garden, the moors, the wide pewter sky. His hand found hers. She held on.